Hollywood Palace will not be seen tonight, so that we may bring you the following special program from ABC News. Watch Hollywood Palace next week at its usual time. Senator Robert F. Kennedy, Democrat of New York, versus Senator Eugene J. McCarthy, Democrat of Minnesota, appearing in their first official confrontation on ABC News Issues and Answers, a special report. To moderate this joint appearance, ABC News anchorman Frank Reynolds.
Good evening. Tonight, two declared aspirants for the presidential nomination of the Democratic Party are in the same room before the same television cameras and radio microphones to engage in a discussion, or if you will, a debate on the issues, the problems, and the opportunities that confront the American people this year. This program comes at a significant, perhaps a critical time for both Senator Robert F. Kennedy of New York and Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota. Next Tuesday, the Democratic voters of California, in their primary election, will express their preference. Both Senator Kennedy and Senator McCarthy are on the ballot in this state. Both have campaigned extensively and vigorously. They will be questioned tonight by ABC News correspondent Bob Clark and ABC News political editor Bill Lawrence. We shall alternate questions to each candidate, and the man who is not asked the question will have an opportunity to comment on the answer given by his opponent. I might say the arrangements for this program were worked out with representatives of both candidates. And to start the discussion, I will address a question to both. Before the broadcast, it was decided by a flip of the coin that Senator McCarthy would answer first. Well, both senators, really, you are presenting yourselves tonight to the American people and to the voters of California as candidates for the presidency. If, in fact, you were president, what would you do at this time that President Johnson is not doing in order to bring peace in Vietnam? Senator McCarthy?
There are two or three things that I would be doing, or at least recommending, if I were president at this time. I would be de-escalating the war in Vietnam, drawing back from some of our advanced positions while still holding strength in Vietnam. I would not have the Secretary of State making statements about how we would have no coalition government to come out of the conference in Paris, nor have someone saying that the Vice President made a slip of the tongue when he talked about involving the National Liberation Front. I think these are the important positions that have to be taken. One, a de-escalation of the war, and secondly, a recognition that we have to have a new government in South Vietnam. I'm not particularly concerned whether it's called a coalition or a fusion or a new government of some kind. And we have to recognize that that government would include the National Liberation Front. I think this is prerequisite to any kind of negotiations that may move on to talk about what the nature of that new government might be. We've not really made any significant changes that I can see in terms of our activities or our words. We're calling up more troops. We say we're going to send more troops. We have intensified the bombing. So that, taken all together, I don't see either in action or in word any significant change on the part of the administration since the negotiations began.
Senator Kennedy?
Well, I'd pursue the negotiations in Paris. At the same time, I'd make it quite clear that we would expect that Saigon, the government in Saigon, would begin their own negotiations with the National Liberation Front. I would be opposed to what I understand Senator McCarthy's position of forcing a coalition government on the government of Saigon, a coalition with the communists, even before we begin the negotiations. I would make it quite clear that we are going to the negotiating table not with the idea that we want them to unconditionally surrender, and that we expect that the National Liberation Front and the Viet Cong will play some role in the future political process of South Vietnam, but that should be determined by the negotiators, and particularly by those people of South Vietnam. I think that's terribly important that we accept that, because without accepting that, what we're really asking for is unconditional surrender, and they're not going to turn over their arms, lay down their arms, live in peace, if the votes and the government's going to be run by General Key and General Thieu. The next point, I would demand privately and publicly an end of public corruption, the official corruption that exists in Vietnam, a land reform program that's meaningful so that they can gain the support of the people themselves. I would pull back from the demilitarized zone. I think that's an important area, but I would permit the troops of South Vietnam to remain there rather than American troops. where a third of our casualties have occurred. I would, or half really, and I would end the search and destroy missions by American troops and American Marines and let the South Vietnamese soldiers and troops carry that burden of the conflict. I would make it clear as we went along that the South Vietnamese are going to carry more and more of the burden of conflict. I'm not going to accept the idea that we can draft a young man from the United States, send him to South Vietnam to fight and maybe to die, while at the same time a young man, if he's wealthy enough, can buy his way out of the draft in South Vietnam.
Bill Lawrence?
Bill, can I say, I didn't say I was going to force the coalition government on South Vietnam. I said that we should make clear that we're willing to accept that. Now, if the South Vietnamese want to continue to fight, work out their own negotiation, that is well and good. But I don't think there's much point in talking about reform in Saigon or land reform, because we've been asking for that for at least 5 years, and it hasn't happened.
Senator Kennedy, last week or this week at his press conference in Texas, the president indicated he was not closing any of his options, and that indeed he was considering perhaps resuming bombing farther north around Hanoi and Haiphong if something didn't happen in Paris pretty soon. Was this a wise move in the interest of peace?
Well, I think escalating the conflict again is not going to be a wise move. I think that the decision, as I read about it in the newspapers, as to why they de-escalated and went to the conference table was made on the basis that the bombing hadn't been successful. I think that the reports of the intelligence community shows quite clearly that rather than having been successful, it strengthened the will of the people of North Vietnam to resist the United States and resist the outside, as they describe us as the outside aggressors. So I think just to resume the bombing in that fashion is not going to be any more successful now than it's been in the past. Third, Secretary McNamara has already testified before congressional committees that the bombing of the North does not stop the North from sending whatever men and materials they need into the South. What in the last analysis is needed in South Vietnam is the people themselves to have the will to fight. If they don't have that will, no matter how many men we send over there, how many bombs we drop, and we're dropping more now than we dropped in the Second World War, no matter how much we do of that, if they don't have the will and the desire themselves, no matter what we do, we can't instill that in them. And that's why I want to make it clear, if I was President of the United States, and why I was critical back in 1965, because I thought we were making it America's war, we were militarizing the conflict, that this is the South Vietnamese war. I'm opposed to unilaterally withdrawing from there, but they have to carry the major burden of this conflict. It can't be carried by American soldiers.
Well, Senator McCarthy, in commenting on Senator Kennedy's answer, would you also take into account the charge made by some critics of the administration, who are more hawkish, that we give the North Vietnamese a rather clear berth by telling them exactly what we're not going to do, and that this doesn't increase the pressure for peace?
Well, I don't think it makes much difference, because we're really doing enough to them in any case, and to say we're not going to do more in this particular area doesn't really change the ratio, it seems to me, of force to any significant degree. As far as the bombing is concerned, for example, the question of what areas you bomb is not as important, it seems to me, as how intensely you bomb the areas that you are bombing. Now, I look upon the bombing question really as one that has to be considered in relation to what we are doing with reference to other troop movements in South Vietnam. Whether to resume or not to resume, I think, has now become really a tactical question that, since negotiations have started, and also a practical question, because we've had through the years testimony from many experts saying that it was wasteful, that it wasn't accomplishing anything, that we were losing planes and spending money and not breaking. I remember Secretary McNamara telling us in early '66 that if we resumed the bombing and intensified, he said, they'll be able to infiltrate up to 4,500 men a month and supply them, and then we can wear them down in South Vietnam. By June of that year, the report was they were infiltrating up to 7,000 a month after the bombing had been intensified. And his explanation was that the number they could infiltrate had always been X, which is what it has been.
Bob Clark.
Senator McCarthy, the McCarthy for President Committee, your McCarthy for President Committee, has been running full-page ads in California papers in recent days saying that Senator Kennedy must bear part of the responsibility for the decision to intervene in Vietnam. And the implication seems to be that even though he's been a war critic for the past 3 years, he should be ruled out as president because of his participation in that decision in the Kennedy administration. Is that what you mean?
I don't think we said he should be ruled out at all, Bob. He has said he'd take some responsibility for it. The question is how much responsibility. I was talking more about the process. I said this is one of the things we ought to talk about, is the process by which decisions were made with reference to this war. Because one of our problems has been to find out, who decided and who's responsible and on what kind of evidence did we have this kind of escalation.
Could I just
And
ask,
I'd say that ad ran only one day, and that I had
it
not
also
seen
said
it.
that I intervened in the
Dominican
Dominican
Republic,
Republic.
that's
Now, how
right.
did they get that?
Well, I think what they did, I
wasn't even in government at the time.
Well, you weren't out very long,
But I
don't want to fault you on that.
But it said it, and then it ran again today.
It ran only, we stopped it, it may have run in 2 papers, but I don't think it ran twice.
Well, I saw it again this morning, and I was
They might have
responsible for the
showed it
Dominican
to you.
Republic. I wasn't even in the government, and I criticized it.
Well, what I said was that this was a process that was involved in our going into Cuba, involved in our going into the Dominican Republic, and also into Vietnam, and that I wanted to talk about the process. But in any case, I had not seen the ad. When I saw it, I said, stop it, and they stopped it as soon as they could, which is not quite what happened to the voting record of McCarthy, which was distributed across the country, which is being mailed out in this state right now.
Is continuing? Would you like to respond to that, Senator?
I don't know to what he was referring to.
Well, I have it in my pocket.
Senator Kennedy, you did get very upset about that ad in a speech.
Well, I think he has some reasons. I got somewhat upset over what was said to be my voting record. But they were nice in this guy. They took a picture of me when I was about 40 years old, which I looked young, and it's a good comparison. I'm young in spirit. I'm about that young.
But you used these words on Friday. You said the great crusade that began for the United States is now involved in a campaign to distort me and to stop me. Did you mean or did you feel at that time that Senator McCarthy was trying to distort you or stop you?
That was distortion of the record, which I think Senator McCarthy just agreed to. It was a distortion of the record.
Can I ask both you senators, really, you are critics of the war. Do you ever have the feeling that perhaps some of your comments might be encouraging the North Vietnamese to procrastinate in the peace negotiations in Paris, in the belief that perhaps if either of you is elected, they will get a better deal? That charge is frequently made. Senator McCarthy?
Well, I think that charge has been made by a number of people. It's been made by General Westmoreland. It's been hinted at by Secretary Rusk. But of course, if we accepted it, we would have no dissent. No newspaper man could criticize. No one could raise his voice against the war. And I don't know whether it has encouraged them or not. I've seen no evidence since we became critics, or rather strongly, many of us in the Senate, in 1966, that the North Vietnamese began to wait for a political settlement in this country. All the evidence is that they don't really know any more about American politics than, I hesitate to say you, Bill, but you couldn't anticipate much what's going to happen here 3 months ago, and I think that the North Vietnamese have laid all their plans in terms of a military confrontation. I've seen no evidence at any point of any change in their policy that anticipated or tried to anticipate the politics of the United States of America.
What I think is quite clear is where the difference has been made is not here in the United States, but in South Vietnam. When I spoke out in 1965 about when we began to Americanize the war and militarize the war, I said, I predicted at that time that what would occur. Now, the military, Vice President Humphrey, the others in the administration said that I was wrong, that we were going to be successful, that we were at the light at the end of the tunnel. I had conversations with representatives of the administration who said that I was going to be destroyed politically for taking the position I did. It was what they were doing in South Vietnam, and the fact that we were making it America's war, it was a continuation of what the French had been doing there, and we were looked upon as the enemies. And the government of Saigon was doing nothing in the way of reform, political reform, social reform, economic reform, all the land reform to gain the support of the peasants in the villages. That's what I criticized, Americanizing the war and not taking the steps that would gain the support of the people. You can't be successful then. You can't be effective. And that war cannot be successful until that happens, no matter how many men we send over there, no matter how many men that die, no matter how much napalm we drop, no matter how many bombs we drop in the north. It can't be successful. So to say, as a member of the Senate, as Senator McCarthy and I are, we're not going to say anything about this, we're not going to mention it, even though we know it's wrong and it's going to be ineffective, would be the height of lack of patriotism. We, as Camus said, I love my country, but I love it in justice.
Senator Kennedy, President Johnson has been emphasizing to the world in general, and particularly to foreign leaders such as the leader of South Korea and the Australian Prime Minister, his view that no matter who is the next president, the United States will keep its commitments in Asia. Now, is the president speaking for you as a potential next president?
What those commitments, I would have to have an outline of what those commitments
Say Korea, for example.
I expect that we're going to remain in Korea. I think that we have a position around the world that we cannot ignore. I don't think that position rests on military powers so much as what our moral leadership is, what we do here within the United States and what we stand for around the rest of the globe.
Well, how would we react, for example, to a renewal of aggression from North Korea into South Korea?
Well, I think that that aggression would be against the United Nations, which is still the power within South Korea, which still has the nominal head of the armed forces within South Korea, so that I would expect the United Nations would act. I think that's far more advisable than what we're doing at the moment, which is where we're acting ourselves. I do think that we have some commitments around the globe. I think we have a commitment to Israel, for instance, that has to be kept. But what I don't think is that we can be the policeman of the world and go in all over the rest of the globe and settle every internal dispute with American soldiers or American arms. And that is the tendency that I sense over the period of the last 2 or 3 years.
Senator McCarthy?
Bill, early in my campaign, there were people who said this was a new kind of Midwestern isolationism. And some of the columnists said this is a retreat from responsibility. I was quick to say then that I'd been a strong defender of President Truman and his intervention in Korea. I gave really was a paper justifying what he was doing. I think we have clear obligations to the Chinese and Formosa and Taiwan. We have clear obligations to the Japanese by virtue of the treaty ending that war, which we demilitarized Japan. We have clear obligations to India to speak only about Asia. We have responsibility, as the Senator said, clear moral and legal responsibilities in the Middle East to Israel. And also, I think, a strong obligation to maintain strength in NATO. As to the other areas of Southeastern Asia, Thailand and Malaysia, Indonesia, Laos, Cambodia, we have a very limited commitment there, I think, one which we have to balance against what good can come out of what we might do there, and also balance against our responsibilities in other parts of the world. In other words, not the kind of almost complete commitment in an area where success is very unlikely and which will drain off our resources, physical and moral and of every kind, from attending to our other responsibilities.
Well, Senator, you said that we have a very limited commitment in Southeast Asia, and you ticked off the countries, but it seems to me that at the moment, at any rate, we have kind of an overwhelming commitment there, and that really what you're talking about is scaling down the commitment that the Johnson administration has made.
Well, I don't think we had a legal or a moral commitment to do what we're doing in Vietnam.
Senator McCarthy, excuse me, if we don't have a legal or a moral commitment, then why don't we just get out? And if you're elected president, why not?
Well, you don't do it because there are other complications if you just pull out. You've got some responsibilities that come in consequence of what we've done. And it's a residual kind of moral responsibility and political responsibility, too, that we have to carry on.
Well, do I gather that on
What I'm saying is we didn't have the obligation to put 500,000 men into that country to do what we're doing in that country, or to spend $30 billion to whatever the objective is. And no one anticipated it when we went in. No one said we had this kind of an obligation.
Well, do I gather that aside from Vietnam, though, that there's not really any basic disagreement between you two and the president?
Well, could I say what I think that there's a difference between external aggression and internal turmoil. If there was external aggression, for instance, against India or Pakistan, if China came across the border, I think that would be an entirely different kind of situation than if you had some turmoil within northeast Thailand. In northeast, whether we should assist a country that has this internal difficulty or internal trouble or struggle between two groups, I think depends, an analysis of the situation would depend on whether the government has the support of its people, such as Israel, again, as an example, whether they are making an effort themselves to develop the political and social and economic reforms that are so necessary to gain the support of their people, or whether it's just a society that's built on a strata that has no contact with its people and is just attempting to keep its control by yelling communism to try to get American soldiers in there. I'm opposed, under those circumstances, to sending American soldiers in because I don't think we can be the policeman of the world and straighten out every problem all over the globe.
You have each mentioned our commitment to Israel, and of course many people think that the Middle East will be the next great powder keg and bring the next great confrontation between the East and West. Senator Kennedy, you this past week in Portland proposed that we send 50 jet fighters to Israel. Phantom jets. Well, Senator McCarthy, you have generally supported a moratorium on arms shipments to either side, I believe, or said we should work toward that.
Well, I've said we should work toward it, but I've said we had to maintain the military strength of Israel against the Arab nations, and I've said we had to at least help them rebuild the strength that they lost in the recent war. That means 50 jets, so I'm for 50 jets.
You would support Senator Kennedy's
Oh, I
proposal
think that it's
for
clear
50.
we're really obligated there on many grounds, because we were one of the nations that wouldn't open our doors to the Jewish expellees and refugees after the war, and suggested that the British take care of it in Palestine, and then moved on from that to support in the UN the establishment of the State of Israel. And we've underscored that commitment time and time again since 45 or 47. I don't think there's any question about our obligation.
I don't think I really got an answer to my question, though, gentlemen, as to whether, aside from Vietnam, you really are in basic agreement with the general foreign policy objectives of this administration. Are you, Senator McCarthy?
It depends on what their objectives are. I'm not quite sure what their objectives in Europe are, for example. I don't think things were handled well there, that we could have dealt on somewhat better terms with France to a point where at least the NATO control in communication lines might not have been taken out, and the additional expense of transferring all of that could have been avoided. I don't think we acted properly in the Dominican intervention. We completely ignored the Organization of American States and picked it up kind of as a residual support of our action, but largely really ignoring the OAS and what we'd committed ourselves to in that. And I think that through the years we've not really used the United Nations as we should have. This is not the policy question, but using the ambassador pretty much as a simple agent of the administration, instead of insisting that he represent us really in terms also of the United Nations Charter. Generally, we've acted as though the UN had application to countries in the Eastern Hemisphere, not to the Western Hemisphere, and really had nothing to do not much to do with problems in which the United States was involved. So these are all questions of foreign policy, on which I disagree. They're not as serious, I suppose, at least in practical consequences, as Vietnam, but these are points of disagreement.
Do you want to comment on
Well,
that?
I was a member of the National Security Council for 3.5 years, and was involved in some of those matters during that period of time in connection with Latin America and in connection with Africa, with the Test Ban Treaty, and I suppose the most critical crisis that's ever been faced by mankind, the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. I don't think that we can ignore the rest of the world. I don't think we can act as if it doesn't exist and separate ourselves from the rest of the world. And we have to be obviously interested and concerned about what occurs elsewhere. But what I think we have to make it clear, and which we did, I think, during the early 1960s, was that we can't be the nation's policeman. We cannot settle every struggle or every problem that exists everywhere, all over the globe, and the internal struggle that goes on between one power group versus another power group within, whether it's Latin America or whether it's in Asia. On the other hand, we can't ignore what happens. For instance, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the missiles coming into Cuba. What if the same kind of arrangement was made in another Latin American country? That threatens our national security. We not only have, therefore, some national responsibility and possibly a moral responsibility in some ways, but we also have an arrangement that meeting our national security needs is vital and terribly important for the next generation of Americans, because we now have the weapons that can destroy all of mankind.
Senator Kennedy, if we can move on here to some of our domestic problems, which we want to cover. You've been telling campaign audiences that if you become president, you're going to do away with riots and violence in this country, that they simply won't be tolerated. What specific methods are you going to use to accomplish this? And I mean, aside from the long-range efforts to improve life in the nation's ghettos.
Well, I think what I've said is that as Attorney General, I was the Chief Law Enforcement Officer, and I know how important it is that we abide by the law, and violence and rioting and lawlessness cannot be tolerated in the United States. A high administration official said a short time ago that we can expect rioting summer after summer. I don't think that's acceptable in the United States. I would help police departments through funds I would help in the experience that we've gained over the period of the last several years. When I was Attorney General of the United States, we had a riot at the University of Mississippi, and yet no one fired a gun, the marshals or the troops that came into that area. We kept a mob under control in the University of Alabama. We did it at the same time in the Freedom Riders. I therefore had some experience in dealing with these kind of problems. The second part of it, which I think is terribly important, is the fact that we have some communication with those who feel that they are suffering from injustices. I've gone into the ghettos, I've gone and talked to the Indians or Mexican Americans or whatever group and said we can't solve these problems overnight. They cannot be solved by violence and lawlessness. But what we can do is to start at least providing jobs and employment for people. And people look at the statistics across the United States and say there's only 3.5% unemployed. In some of these areas, the unemployment is 30, 40%. In some parts of the United States, it goes up to 80%. I've been to Indian villages where it's 100%. I think we have to provide jobs, with the government being the employer of the last resort, and then bringing the private sector in a major way and hiring people, doing as much as possible with the welfare system, the handout of the dole, and getting people jobs by giving the private sector tax incentives and tax credits.
Senator McCarthy?
Well, I think I'm in general agreement. I think everyone feels that we need better police forces now, that there ought to be more federal money given to state and local authorities so that we could have more policemen and more patrolmen, that the use of either federal troops or National Guard should be a very reserved use. I think the way in which they responded generally in the riots following the assassination of Martin Luther King was entirely commendable, on the side of restraint, without shooting, without violence. That this must be, and also we must have interim programs if there is a threat of violence before we get around to doing the things that have to be done. But I think that critical to all of this is our really giving a genuine hope to people who live in the ghettos or who live in poverty. In my judgment, the principal cause of the riots, and this is as old as the history really of riots, is this, that with the passage of civil rights legislation, the kind of new spirit that moved in this country and around the world, that Negroes particularly, but also other minorities in this country, have been kept really as a kind of colonial nation living in our midst. And they quite suddenly said, we are going to be free. And we said, that's fine, we're going to pass civil rights legislation, we're going to set you free. And then having done that, they went back to the same old miserable house, they went back to the same old job, they went back to the same poverty and the same ill health they'd known before, the rats that they've talked about. And what we have to do is to begin to build 1 million houses a year for the low-income people. Our housing is worse now than it was in 1948. The congestion in the ghettos is worse than it was. So we have to open it up so that you can say to people, well, in 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, all of you will somehow be set free from at least these physical conditions. And unless we do that, then I think we have to face the prospect that no matter how many police we have, no matter how much repression we have, there will be protests, there will be some violence in America.
But there's been the implication in both of your campaigns that President Johnson should somehow have done more than he has done in order to quell riots once they started. Do each of you really feel that the White House, that Mr. Johnson could have snuffed out these riots if he just acted in some other way?
I don't think that there's there's a feeling that there's really any hope. If you take the riots that occurred last summer, there's no excuse for the riots, and as I made it clear, we can't tolerate the violence or lawlessness in the United States. But as far as having a program, we said a prayer and we appointed a commission, the Kerner Commission, after the riots of last summer. But after the prayer and after the Kerner Commission came in and made a report, there hasn't been anybody from the administration that's come in and said, this is what we should do. These are the steps that we need to take. So I don't believe the people in the ghettos or the people that are living in poverty expect that this is all going to be resolved overnight. But what I do think that they feel is that we're going to make some progress. White people think, well, we paid all these taxes for the poverty program. We paid the taxes for the education program. We paid taxes for the civil rights program. Why aren't they happy? The fact is, for them, as the Labor Department said, the situation is getting worse, not better. And there aren't any jobs there. That's what I've tried to do in the biggest ghetto of the United States. I've tried to bring in, have them organized so that they have some control over their own future, which I think is terribly important around this country. That people don't think that all control is in the hands of the federal government, that they have some control over their own future. And then the private sector can come in and help and assist with the federal government. But we decentralize control so that people have a feeling that what they do is going to be of significance and importance. And I don't think that philosophy exists in the United States government at the present time. All we know is the welfare handout, and that's not satisfactory, and it hasn't been adequate, and it won't ever be.
Senator McCarthy?
Well, Bob, I don't think I ever said that the president handled the riots badly. I think there might have been one action that I criticized some, and that was when it appeared as though it was a kind of war of nerves between him and the governor of Michigan, in which I thought perhaps the federal troops were not sent in time, or the federal decision was not made quite in time. But there was a very delicate balance in that case. But what I said was that they didn't seem to have a sense of, really, of need. I was the chairman of a committee on unemployment problems back in 1959, in which we really laid out everything that's in the President's Commission as to what this country needed. And even before that, in 48, after the war, the campaigns of 48 talked about housing and education and jobs, the Full Employment Act of 46. It's all been there for 20 years, and my concern was over a question of priorities. The war itself, for example, we couldn't get money for rent subsidies. We couldn't get money for public housing in 1964 or 65, not enough. But in 1966, we could spend $20 billion on a war in Vietnam, which was economically a depressing war. So it was a question of priorities with reference to the war, but even without the war, a question of expanding the space program to a point where we're spending $3 to $4 billion a year. I mean, so I'm against the space program, but as this was planned and as it was projected, we should have been as much concerned about the problems here in America, and we weren't.
Well, if you gentlemen in Congress, though, are going to insist another $6 billion as the price of a tax increase, aren't we really going to take that out of the welfare programs?
A good deal of it will come out. The austerity program last year cut into the welfare program.
I'm would be opposed to doing it in that fashion. I think to take the $6 billion, agree to the $6 billion without knowing where it's coming from. We cut $25 million from the Head Start program, which is going to mean 1,000 students already in the Head Start program here in the state of California who will be excluded, 4,000 in the state of Mississippi. We only hit 1/3 of the students already in the Head Start program. We're only hitting 7% approximately of what we had anticipated in the field of education. We cut back by 1/3 our air pollution efforts. We cut back by 1/3 our water pollution efforts. We've taken all of these steps already. I know that there have to be cuts in the budget, but what I object to is just a blanket cut of $6 billion, which will have a tremendous effect on the internal development of our country.
Well,
we can fight for freedom 12,500 miles away, but we must do something to deal with the quality of life, the property taxes, for instance, here in the state of California, which are so astronomically high, the problems of poverty. All of these problems that affect the American people must receive our first priority. I recognize the importance of our national security because we build up our security forces in 61, 62, and 63. But I also recognize the importance of doing what we need to do for our own people within our own country.
Yeah, we cut back the housing proposals by roughly 90% below what the President's Commission said we needed, and 50% or more below what the President said we needed, and we haven't even acted on it yet.
Could I say, though, I don't think those housing programs are going to be satisfactory any more than the housing programs that we've had over the last 20 years. Public housing has not been adequate. And 221D3, which is the other major housing program, has not built the housing where it's necessary in the United States. I think a far less expensive way is to bring in the private sector and have them do it.
This is an interesting point. I think it points up a difference in your basic programs for housing.
I don't think it does, no.
Well, I'm thinking of this, Senator McCarthy.
All right.
Generally, Senator Kennedy, you want to rebuild the ghettos. You want to bring the private sector in to help revive the ghetto and bring the
rural
jobs
areas
into the ghettos.
To both places, into urban areas where there's unemployment or where people are on welfare, and in the rural areas of the United States, so you keep people where they are at the present time.
Essentially, you would
break
down
some
the
difference
barriers.
there. Well, I didn't know he was there. Yes, I would say that we've got to get to the suburbs, too, with this kind of housing, because some of the jobs are in the city and some jobs are being built there, but most of the employment is now in the belt line outside of the cities, and I don't think we ought to perpetuate the ghetto if we can help it, even by putting better houses there for them, or low-cost houses. That what we've got to do is to try to really break that up. Otherwise, we're adopting a kind of apartheid in this country, a practical apartheid. And I see that some industry can go into the ghetto, but some of the housing has got to go out of the ghetto, so that there's a distribution of races throughout the whole structure of our cities and on into our rural areas. But so far as who builds, I think there's no question that it has to be a private sector sort of an effort. And it means funding, I think, $5 or $6 billion a year eventually for this kind of housing, in the same way as we funded roughly $4 to $5 billion a year for the interstate highway program, or the same way we funded for the rural electrification program back in the 30s. But it has to be there so that men can plan, the construction industry can adjust, the building trades can adjust, and it'll be there not for 1 year and then go down, not there while interest rates are low and then disappear when interest rates go high, but clearly funded so as to carry over a period of from 5 to 10 years until the housing needs of this country are in fact met.
Could I make just a comment on
Go
that?
ahead.
I'm all in favor of moving people out of the ghettos, but we have 14 million Negroes who are in the ghettos at the present time. We have here in the state of California 1 million Mexican Americans whose poverty is even greater than many of the black people. I mean, you say that you're going to take 10,000 black people and move them into Orange County, the people that graduate from high school, which are only 3 out of 10 of the children who go to these schools, only 3 out of 10 graduate from high school, and the ones that graduate from high school have the equivalent of an 8th grade education. So to take them out, where 40% of them don't have any jobs at all, that's what you're talking about. If you're talking about 100 people, then that's one thing. But if you're talking about hitting this problem in a major way, to take those people out, put them in the suburbs where they can't afford the housing, where their children can't keep up with schools, and where they don't have the skills for the jobs, is just going to be catastrophic. I want to move as other groups have moved in the United States, that as they get the jobs and they get the training, then they themselves can move out into other areas of the United States and will be accepted and will find jobs and employment. But that does not exist. That's not the conditions that we're facing in this country at the present time.
Senator
Well, I'd
Kennedy,
have to object some. There are estimated 250,000 jobs available, but there aren't people within reach. And I didn't want to raise the point because I thought that you really, when this question was first raised, that this was not your clear position of concentrating that much on the ghetto.
I want to do the things in the suburbs, but what I'm saying is in order to meet the really hardcore heart of the problem, we have to face the fact that a lot of these people are going to live here for another several decades, and they can't live under the conditions that they're living at the present time.
Senator Kennedy, a personal issue has been injected into this campaign by Drew Pearson, and I'm beginning to hear some echoes of it from the Negro community, which is that as Attorney General, you specifically authorized or condoned a wiretap on Martin Luther King. Is this true?
I was involved as Attorney General, had the responsibility for the national security of the United States. Under an agreement that was made by Franklin Roosevelt in 1940, the Attorney General was given permission to give approval of a wiretap. I never gave any permission for bugging. It was given, and nor was ever any permission ever asked in any case. But was given permission to wiretap in cases that involved the national security of the United States, where the Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and others felt that the national security of the United States was threatened. I have never discussed individual cases, and it would be a violation of the law if I did, no matter what the political benefits might be for me. But what I do want to say is that as far as Martin Luther King is concerned, he was a loyal, dedicated American who, in my judgment, made a distinct contribution to this country.
Senator McCarthy, do you have anything to say?
Well, no, not on this. As you know, I was, before this particular case became a part of the news, that I had raised questions about the FBI and about its director, saying that I thought he'd really been there too long to develop, partly it was his age, but he developed a kind of autonomy, as though you would say, well, this was decided by the FBI, and at that point, no one was to question. It was as though he had separate authority, separate from the executive branch of the government. And if the facts as had been reported in the King case, an investigation which could quite properly have been related to national security. But what was picked up was a lot of information which had no relationship to national security. But it goes into the FBI files, it rests there, and eventually it comes out and it can be applied under entirely different circumstances. And it seems to me that if the right direction of the FBI, that someone would have to be concerned about what went into the files, however it was obtained, wiretap or bugging, and why it was left there. So that it would then come out sometime later in a issue completely unrelated to the original purpose of the tap or whatever other police activity might be involved. And my judgment is that this has run long enough under one head, and we ought to have another look at it with the new director, because there are enough indications of practices there that I think should be challenged.
Well, now, Mr. Hoover worked directly for you. Would you keep him, or would you
I
let him
said
go?
that I'm not going to deal in personalities. We've had occasionally had our differences, and as you know, but I haven't tried to describe or name the people that I would want to keep or those that I would want to release, and I'm not going to.
Well, I remember it was almost the first appointment announced by your brother the day after election, if I remember correctly.
It was the first, along with Alan Dulles.
Alan Dulles, isn't that right?
Yes.
Of those two together.
Well,
If I'm elected President of the United States, you can watch and see.
There do not seem to be very many differences between Senator McCarthy and Senator Kennedy on anything, really.
Well, let's
Well,
try
where
this
do you
last. I
disagree?
think we might...
What
Well, we
is the
disagree
choice
on
there?
I have
Hoover. In the short run, in
Is
any
that
case.
going to be the
I have
decisive
great
factor of the
admiration for
election?
Senator McCarthy.
I think we probably disagree some on Dean Rusk and on Robert McNamara and some of the persons in government.
Do you disagree on Dean Rusk and Robert
Ask me a
McNamara?
question.
Well, do you think Dean Rusk has been a good Secretary of State?
I think he's been a very dedicated American, committed to performing a service for the United States. I happen to disagree with the policies that he's espousing in very important areas of this country, but he's entitled to his opinion, as I'm entitled, and he gives me credit for mine, but I don't question his integrity.
Has he been there too long, Senator?
I think that, I think with all the problems that are affecting the United States, with the internal problems that we have and our problems around the rest of the world, to talk about it in terms of personality or whether somebody's been there too long, I made it quite clear that I think that I disagree with him, but as I say, I think he's a dedicated American.
I think personality, Senator, if I may disagree with you for a moment, have a good deal to do with policy, especially in the way in which they're administered, which was the purpose of my asking the question.
But I think to say, try to answer it on the basis of who you're going to fire and who you're going to continue in office, obviously I have a direct difference, quite clear difference with the Secretary of State. I doubt very much that he would want to remain under those circumstances, but I don't want to be playing games with people's reputation or what I'm going to do with them or not going to do them. He served the country in the way that he thinks is most fitting. I happen to disagree with it. If you have a President of the United States that disagrees with the Secretary of State, I don't imagine that they stay together very long. Doesn't that speak for itself?
I don't really think it does. I think we give cabinet members too much protection. They say he's a dedicated man, he's serving the country, that they ought to be held answerable for policy mistakes and for position mistakes. I think your brother was too kind to a number of people after the Bay of Pigs myself.
Could I tell you, though? Oh, excuse me.
I think he was. I think that this builds a certain weakness into the American government, I think. You say, well, this is a man who was appointed, therefore we have to protect him. I think cabinet members ought to be more expendable than senators, really.
Right.
And that, well, they make mistakes. As in the British cabinet system, you say, well, all right, you made a mistake, now you go.
Well, maybe Senator
But if a
Kennedy...
man makes a mistake now, well, you can't let him go. He's built in. You're likely to go if you've been successful. They say, well, you've been a great secretary, goodbye.
Maybe Senator Kennedy feels some responsibility because he kept Dean Rusk from being vice president. You remember the
No, I don't.
excuse for not putting you on the ticket also ruled out Rusk.
Well, I think that's what I've said, that if you're trying to cut one fellow out of the crowd, you take one cow, you take them all. And President Johnson took the whole cabinet out at that time.
Yeah, I know. They all took it. But could I just say that I think if, as a member of the cabinet, a member of the National Security Council, and involved in some decisions during that period of time, the President of the United States makes the decision. And there are always opposite points of view as to what should be done and what policy should be followed. I can't think of one decision, whether it's in connection with Panama, whether it was in connection with NATO, whether it was in connection with Latin America, whether it was in connection with the Congo, whether it was in connection with any part of the world in which people didn't have opposite points of view. In the last analysis, the President of the United States makes the decision. I think it was perfectly proper for him. He gets the credit for things that go well, and he's going to take the blame for things that go wrongly. But it's not if he doesn't like the Secretary of State or doesn't agree with the Secretary of State or doesn't feel that he's administering his department properly, there's no difficulty in breaking that relationship. I sent a memorandum to President Kennedy one time because I saw that Daniel Webster, after he became after Tyler became president, after Harrison died, that he said that all decisions had been made during that administration under Harrison by a majority vote of the cabinet. Instead of the president deciding, the cabinet would decide, and everybody had one vote, including the president. And I suggested that to President Kennedy, that we might follow that procedure. Instead of having him make all these decisions, why didn't he let us? But he never answered it.
Well, I don't think that at all. I don't think I'd have that system, but let's take the case of Rusk now. There's no question about when we were trying to get Vietnam before the United Nations, Arthur Goldberg came down and testified and said he would be glad to try and gave a serious presentation. Rusk off on the sideline said it would be an exercise in futility. And I've listened to him for the roughly 5 years I've been on Foreign Relations Committee, and I think it's wholly in order, really, to make a judgment about him in a campaign, to say that a man of these views and of this disposition, nothing else, he's so alienated the Foreign Relations Committee that for nearly 2 years he wouldn't testify in public. And I think there are two committees you've got to have as president in order to really run the country very well. You have to have the support and the response of the Finance Committee and the Ways and Means Committee in the House. The committee of which Mr. Mills is chairman. I served on it for 4 years. This is the Tax Committee. This is the committee which is critical, really, to fiscal policy. And if you've alienated that committee, as it has been for 1.5 years, this is the first time in the 20 years I've been in Congress that a committee has refused an administration request for a major tax bill for 18 months. And I think maybe the first time, at least in modern history of the last 100 years, that a committee of the Congress has said to the President, before we'll give you a tax bill, you've got to cut the budget $6 billion. This verges on, either on anarchy or on revolt. Nothing like it has happened. And the other committee is the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate. Now, President...
Those just happen to be committees of which you're...
I happen to be on both of them.
Yeah.
I mean, I have been on one. I'm on the Foreign Relations Committee. The Finance Committee is not quite as important as the Ways and Means Committee because it's a little bit secondary. But Foreign Relations is a committee which a president has to have in order to run the foreign policy of this country. And you've seen it build up, I think, with reference to Vietnam. They laughed about the committee at first. They said, look at the people you've got on that committee. But gradually the resistance developed. It's not only with reference to Vietnam, but in other areas of decision. We couldn't get $200 million for the Asian Bank out of that committee because of the antagonism between the committee and largely Rusk and also the President, but he was not a good Secretary of State. We couldn't get I was for both of these, we couldn't get a simple tax treaty through between the United States and Brazil. We couldn't even get some simple reorganization acts through affecting State Department personnel. And you may recall that Truman, people like that, got along with Vandenberg. But these are most important considerations, and I think when a cabinet member gets in the way of this kind of relationship, that it's wholly in order to say that he's a bad man to have in that position.
You mentioned his responsibility, Senator, really, for not getting these things out?
Well, I think it's the President's responsibility to replace him.
Yeah, but that's what my point is, Senator.
Yeah.
I mean, you talked about the fact that he wouldn't appear before the Foreign Relations Committee for 2 years. I share your concern, but all the President of the United States has to do is say, go up and appear before the Foreign Relations
That's what I would do.
While we're talking about taxes, as Senator McCarthy was a moment ago, the President has again made a very strong appeal for this 10% surcharge. Yet both you gentlemen are opposed to it, if I understand you correctly.
Well, I have said that I would take an increase in taxes. I think the 10% is too high, and I think it's too unfair to middle-income groups in the United States. It puts the heaviest burden on the lower and the middle-income groups, so therefore I have reservations about that. Secondly, I would like a tax reform program, and a real tax reform program. There are dozens of people in the United States who make more than $200,000 a year who pay no taxes at all. There are dozens of people who make more than $1 million a year who pay no taxes at all. The person on the average who makes $200,000 a year in this country pays the same percentage in taxes as the person who makes between $11,000 and $12,000 a year. I think that's unfair. I think it's unjust and unreasonable. There's a man that's worth more than $1.5 billion in this country who paid in a recent year $660 in taxes, and the next year he paid $685 in taxes. I don't think that's just, and so while we're going to have a tax increase, and it might be necessary, I would also like to see a tax reform program so that all people pay their just share of taxes.
Senator McCarthy, are you for people paying their just share?
I think everyone is for that. The question of eliminating inequities in the code was these real loopholes are the things we should have attacked in the big tax cut of '64 when we were cutting everyone's taxes and We did make a slight move in that year on oil depletion allowance, the only thing we've been able to do in roughly 20 years that I've been in Congress, during which we've been trying to do something about oil depletion allowance. I think we got 40 million increase that year. So far as the specific question of the surtax is concerned, I recommended early that they use other taxes, that they use credit controls and some selective excise instead of the surtax. They've not done that, and we may be down to the point now where it's a choice of forcing the president to cut the budget or expenditures by $6 billion, or to have a greater increase even in the surtax. As I look at the economic indicators with some care, I think that we may have to be forced to grant the president the surtax of 6 or maybe 8% as an alternative to what they're talking about now, 6% plus a $6 billion cut.
You have each in the campaign proposed and been proposing rather dramatic new federal programs to eliminate poverty and improve education and provide everybody with a decent job and rebuild the cities and have more housing. Yet you each seem to be telling the voters that all of these things really won't cost very much. Neither one of you are even espousing the full 10% surtax.
Could I just say that first I'm going to recognize my responsibilities, and none of these things are easy. But as far as the job program is concerned, the job program that I've suggested with the private enterprise system and the tax incentives for the private enterprise system is not going to be costly. And in fact, as Douglas Dillon was Secretary of Treasury and Mortimer Kaplan was Commissioner of Internal Revenue, said it will not cost the Treasury money. The housing program that I've suggested would be half as expensive as the housing programs that we have at the present time. So I think that makes much more sense, and the decentralizing control, I think, makes much more sense than anything that we have at the moment.
Senator McCarthy, do you really feel that you can accomplish all these things without a big tax increase?
Well, not if we continue to spend as much as we're doing in Vietnam. If we hold it at this level and allow the economy to grow, I think we can pay for it out of current revenue. But I have said it's going to cost us $15 billion a year to do these things, and we're going to have to pay for it.
Gentlemen, I'd like to point out at this point now that I think we've come to the end of the question and answer section of this program. I'd like to give each of you a couple of minutes to just speak to the country and say why you should be the next president of the United States. Senator Kennedy?
Well, I've had as I mentioned, the experience in the executive branch of the government, the National Security Council, as Attorney General of the United States. I was involved in the three great questions that affect our country: the problems of peace, the problems of races getting along together, and the problems of the development of the problems of riots and violence in this country. I think that based on that experience and the work that I've done in the Senate of the United States, as well as in the executive branch of the government, that experience I've had, the test ban treaty, the Cuban Missile Crisis, that perhaps there is something that I can contribute in the cause of peace, of trying to end the conflict that now exists in Vietnam. And as Thomas Jefferson said, standing for the last best hope of mankind, which we are in this country. We've dealt with the problems of riots while I was Attorney General of the United States, and we also dealt with the problems of equal justice. I think it's very easy to talk in generalities, but I've sponsored specific pieces of legislation. In the last analysis, however, it's up to the people of California and it's up to the people of the United States to make their judgment and determination about any of us. I'm going to dedicate myself, no matter what happens, to the betterment and improvement of this country and the people, and the choice really is up to you, and I'm glad that it is that way.
Senator McCarthy?
I've served in the Congress for 20 years, 10 years in the House and 10 years in the Senate, and in that time I think I've served on nearly every one of the critical committees. I've served on agriculture. I think I know something of the problems of rural America. I've served on the Committee on Interior, and I think therefore I know something about the problems of the resources of this country. I've served on the Banking and Currency Committee, and also my background is economics, and therefore I think really fully qualified to deal with the very complicated economic problems, both domestic ones and also the international trade problem and the balance of payments. I've served on both the Ways and Means Committee of the House and the Finance Committee of the Senate, which I think gives me a full familiarity with the tax problems of this country, and on foreign relations for some 5 years. In addition to that, since 1949, we've been involved in the problem of civil rights. Not only that, but the problem of the migratory workers. I was the first back in '52 to begin to raise the question about them. And whereas I may not get the same kind of immediate response from them, I think that when they begin to look at my record, they will say, here is someone who's been concerned about us for a long, long time. He may not have received any publicity, but he saw what our needs were, and he began to anticipate that something had to be done about those needs. And I believe that on that basis, the problem of reconciliation with the races will be no particular problem. Secondly, I think that in this year, I sensed what this country needed. Namely, that it needed and wanted a challenge to the President of the United States on the policies of Vietnam and priorities for America. And I think there's something to be said for a president or a presidential candidate who can somehow anticipate what the country wants, especially when what they want is on the side of good and justice, and to provide not real leadership in the sense of saying you've got to follow me, but at least to be prepared to move out ahead somewhat so that the people of the country can follow. And thirdly, I think that I sensed what the young people of this country needed, and whereas young students were dropping out and were saying the establishment is no good, we've had a genuine reconciliation of old and young in this country. And the significance of that is, I think, that through the whole country now, there's a new confidence in the future of America. It's a projection of this country in trust, which has always been the character of this country, and it's in that mood and that spirit that I would act as President of the United States.
Thank you very much, Senator McCarthy and Senator Kennedy. I think we can leave it to others to determine how much heat has come from this program, but I trust there may have been some light, and for that we're all grateful.
Thank you very much.
My thanks, too, to Bob Clark, Bill Lawrence. This is Frank Reynolds in San Francisco. Good night. Strangled if you will. Senator.
Well, I think we just about got off.
Very gentle.
That's
Well, cream puff Lawrence.